Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you to our witnesses for coming this afternoon to give evidence to us. Could I just go down the table and ask you to introduce yourselves and just say the organisation you're representing?
Cool. It's Richard Blakeway. I'm the Housing Ombudsman at the Housing Ombudsman Service.
Darren Bacter, Policy Manager at Shelter.
Ben Beadle, Chief Executive of the National Residential Landlords Association.
Right. Thank you very much for coming. Just a general question. What do you think is the single biggest issue that in the private rental sector that the government needs to address, particularly if you think there are those which they aren't addressing? Who would like to begin? Ben, yes.
Housing supply. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in the Renters Reform Bill, but I'm afraid it's some stuff that needs a nip and a tuck, but this has all the hallmarks of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Rome is burning. We don't have enough homes for people. We have a supply and demand imbalance, and we need to take urgent steps to not just build social housing, but also to make the private rented sector an attractive place to be.
Yeah, sure. We think it's security. The cornerstone of the Renters Reform Bill, obviously, is the scrapping of Section 21, and we're pleased to see that being abolished. We think, though, that there are loopholes and potential weaknesses in the bill, which I'm sure we'll come to later, that can be improved and addressed as the bill goes through its next stages. I think also wanted to take this opportunity to say it's been nearly 2 months now since the first reading of the bill. It's looking like we won't get to the second reading or committee stage till the autumn now, so I just wanted to take this opportunity to urge everyone here and the government to ensure that the bill gets its next stages of scrutiny and gets over the line before the next general election, because renters are waiting for this change.
Richard.
I think there's three interconnected issues around standards, enforcement and scale, and I think the white paper did a really effective job actually of spelling out the private rented sector we have, which is probably not the private rented sector that was envisaged when legislation came in the 1980s. But it might not be the private rented sector we have over the next few years either, because clearly the sector itself is going through quite significant change at the moment. There's clearly been a gap around access to redress and enforcement of standards that exist. The Landlord and Tenant Act, which is a cornerstone of our work as an ombudsman, and there is hardly a cigarette paper, particularly after this white paper in the bill, in terms of the standards expected, but there has been a gap at trying to ensure that there's effective redress and ensure that standards are met, and that's something that needs to be urgently closed.
Right, I think we'll come on and explore those issues in particular, Richard. Right, are there any unintended consequences for all the good intentions, which might well improve many aspects of the current arrangements in the private rent sector? Are there any unintended consequences that you want to draw attention to at this stage? Yes,
yeah, well, I think there are a couple. It's a far-reaching bill. And as I say, I think there's a lot to be welcomed. We'd like to see some changes around students and around making sure that the courts can support these systems. But the unintended consequences are really that we have no clear plan as to timeframes, what's within scope. Take the Ombudsman, for example. Well, what sorts of disputes are going to be covered? We can welcome an Ombudsman, but we need to have certainty. And I'm afraid the only thing that we have at the moment is uncertainty. So we do need to see more clarity around some of the details that are in the bill. Because I think if you take the external factors around increasing mortgage costs and taxation and increasing rents, actually there are landlords that are out there that are thinking about their investments, and we don't want that. We need to keep landlords in the sector. And the second thing is, as we move to a fault-based environment, is the impact that could have in terms of repossession grounds on renters and being able to access homes if they do have their home repossessed. It's not quite as easy to present yourself to the local council to get a property if you have a CCJ or you've made yourself intentionally homeless because you haven't paid your rent or you've committed antisocial behaviour. Those are the two significant ones, Clive, for us.
Yeah, I would agree with some of that. I think, that last point that Ben made there around, CCJs and homelessness applications, I think that's really, for us, a really, really strong argument for ensuring that the grounds are robust as possible. And we understand that, there are concerns from certain landlords and certain people in the sector about landlords' abilities to regain possession of their homes, but the risk there that in response to things like court delays and challenges in getting things through the court, that the eviction grounds are weakened to a level that is too low. There is serious risks of unintended consequences there, in the sense that it may create loopholes for landlords who look to abuse the eviction grounds, where they see, some of the eviction grounds, perhaps the arrears grounds or the antisocial behaviour grounds, but probably most importantly the landlord moving in or sale grounds, where there's opportunity to abuse those grounds, where there are weaknesses there, that in designing the grounds as the way they have in response to concerns about courts, which really is a kind of a different issue, needs to be addressed through different measures. There's a risk of unintended consequences that we see unfair or no fault evictions by the back door after Section 21 is gone. So I think that's an important one that we wanted to highlight.
The white paper did a really good job at setting out what benefit an ombudsman could bring to the sector. I don't think the bill as drafted, though, goes as far enough to meet those expectations. I think the term ombudsman is not used in the bill, notwithstanding the fact that only last year in the Building Safety Act we saw the term ombudsman used, and there's also a risk of redress schemes. Now, whilst the government's been really clear, and it's welcome that that's not their intention, I think were that the route they went down, there's a real risk of unintended consequences, because the more you salami slice redress, the more people will fall through gaps, and particularly vulnerable people will fall through gaps. I think there's also a risk of a two-tier system to redress emerging. To be really, really clear, we are set up as a landlord-tenant scheme. We were set up as that in the 1990s with a mandatory social landlord membership, but a voluntary private landlord membership. That was at a time it was probably never envisaged that we'd have the scale of the sector that we have today. But if you go down different routes, what you'll end up with is not only confusion for the consumer and issues around access, you'll end up with a loss of impact, a lack of consistency, and a lack of clarity around how essentially the same rule set is being interpreted. The Landlord and Tenant Act from 1985, the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation, the Health and Safety Rating System, potentially the Decent Home Standard. There isn't a cigarette paper between the standards a social landlord's meant to meet and the standards that a private landlord is meant to meet, and therefore you need a single place, both that's easy to access but also provides consistent decision making. And I think there's also, briefly, a risk of a kind of big bang moment, because I'm sat here frustrated that I have a voluntary mechanism by which landlords can join, but everyone's waiting to see what happens. Ben referred to uncertainty. Actually, that's not, use that voluntary mechanism to start onboarding landlords now, rather than waiting for a big bang moment, which could just see real confusion and
I think you want to explore some of these issues a bit further.
I do. Before I do, Taryn, you mentioned the unintended consequences of abolishing Section 21. Sorry, it's Taryn. Sorry, I want to address first. Then I'll come to you, Richard, if I may. If we get to a point where people are being evicted under Section 8, do you accept the fact that the consequence for the tenants will be probably county court judgments against them, and potentially a position whereby landlords will be saying, you're too big a risk, I'll take you as a tenant, but I want 12 months deposit or something ridiculous, which people won't be able to afford. And that's potentially the unintended consequence. which we need to guard against.
That's certainly one of the unintended consequences we need to guard against. Again, I think it's particularly a concern if we are designing the eviction grounds in a way that is too weak to protect renters against unfair evictions. We do understand the concern about county court judgments. I think to answer the latter part of your question around landlords' wariness to let to renters with those judgments and renters with different circumstances, we're waiting for clauses in the bill around anti-discrimination clauses, essentially, as we see them. So bans on...
Can I just be clear then? Because I want to get it on record from you guys, if I may. If there were to be included clauses on, as you say, on discrimination, someone who's got a county court judgment against them for non-payment of rent, does Crisis accept that is perfectly reasonable if the court has found there were severe rent arrears?
Shelter, firstly.
Sorry, shelter.
That's okay. I think it's something that's going to have to be looked at and addressed in the bill. It clearly is a risk.
It's a huge risk, which is concerning a lot of us, I think.
Sure.
To make sure we get something in the bill that is clears up the matter.
That would be good.
Can I come in? Just to be clear, Bob, it's not discrimination if a landlord has...
I understand that. It's a legal question.
No, but I just want to point it out that if a tenant's got a CCJ, they haven't paid, they've committed antisocial behaviour, and that's borne out through the court system, a landlord is perfectly within their rights to decline that tenant. That's not discrimination.
Or set conditions, yeah.
Indeed.
Richard, could I take up the issue of the new ombudsman role? Because clearly there must be a concern in your mind, as you were saying, that the position was set up in the 1990s and clearly didn't actually have the impact overall that is expected. How do you see that the new ombudsman impacting the work that you do?
Yeah, I think, well, regardless of whether HOS provides mandatory redress for private landlords, it will have an impact on us. Because at the moment, about 1 in 5 people who approach us, we're not able to help because their landlord or their issue is not in our jurisdiction. And given we have about a 70% awareness rate as an ombudsman, I can't, we don't want to reduce our awareness raising activities because you can create an ombudsman, but 2 people know about it. Can people access it? So we want to reduce that. So we're likely to still see that traffic.
Is there a risk of duplication, or even worse, probably some people falling literally through the cracks? Between the two.
I think there's an absolute risk around people falling through the gaps. But let's be really clear: the Cabinet Office has produced guidance that's been around for many years and was revalidated last year by the Cabinet Office on the creation of redress schemes. And it is explicit in that guidance, this is guidance for departments, it's explicit in that guidance that to avoid unintended consequences, you should build on existing redress services. And we are a redress scheme for landlord and tenants. That we are the only redress scheme for landlord and tenants. And you don't want a 2-tier system for exactly the reasons that the Cabinet Office produced that guidance. And that's exactly why you've seen a natural evolution of other ombudsman schemes, whether it's the local government and social care ombudsman doing private as well as publicly funded social care, or the parliamentary ombudsman doing private as well as public health, or the financial ombudsman services does a whole gamut of stuff. That's exactly the route to go to avoid those unintended consequences.
So what happens, for example, on housing associations that rent out private accommodation? Where do people go then? Do they come to you? Do they go to the ombudsman? What happens?
Well, there's a clause in the bill which I think is puzzling, which suggests that if you're a housing association, those homes should be part of a different redress scheme, should be part of the private rented redress scheme. It is inconceivable that someone renting from a housing association won't think of coming to a housing ombudsman. It is wholly unproductive for us to shut the door on them when they bring their complaint. So you don't want this 2-tier system, but also, and I think for me this is absolutely essential, I mean, not only have we got the expertise, I would say, around the Landlord and Tenant Act, which is distinctly different to agent redress or something like that. It's around the conduct, the conditions and repairs. the Landlord and Tenant Act is clear that those are things which cannot be outsourced to a third party. Those are things the landlord has to deal with. So those are things which we already deal with, and it's a natural evolution, therefore, for us to continue to do it. Managing probably what would be quite a significant volume of inquiries from people, from residents, is going to be a feature for whoever does that. Again, that's something which we have the systems and the know-how to do, but also we can get ahead of, as I say, this big bang moment where there's a real risk that everything's waiting for all the pieces to fall into place, and that's probably quite destabilising for the market, and actually use our voluntary jurisdiction to get ahead of that and smooth out and provide some certainty.
Okay. Ben, what's the impact on private landlords who've voluntarily joined the Ombudsman scheme of this new setup?
Well, I don't know that there are many private landlords that are readily volunteering, to be honest with you. I see a lot of benefit, Bob, in being able to resolve low-level disputes. At the end of the day, this is probably long overdue, and I think it would be good in the consumer's interest and in the landlord's interest to be able to resolve these things. But I think my overriding point is there's a lot of stuff in this bill that needs to be delivered upon, right? And we probably need to find some quick wins. Yep. And I think Richard has done a pretty good sales pitch to set his stall out, but I'll leave for others to decide. Look, we see a great deal of benefit in being able to resolve these matters. It's much like making a sausage. I don't mind what goes in it as long as what comes out the other end is of decent quality, then that's fine. And that means in Ombudsman circles, low cost, no big bureaucracy, quick time frames. That's what landlords and tenants need.
Okay. Tarrant, what are the challenges for private renters in this scheme now, in this proposed scheme?
In the proposed scheme for the Ombudsman?
Yes.
I think Richard would probably be able to speak to that better than myself. So I think a lot of it will depend on how the Ombudsman, when it is set up, how it functions in.
But clearly, one of the purposes behind this is to give tenants the opportunity to go to an independent organisation to resolve the problems that they're facing with their landlords. So surely there must be there either be a very positive impact by having someone look at this, or alternatively, if things go wrong, and they get denied or they go to the wrong ombudsman, things could get delayed.
Yeah, absolutely. No, of course, we support wholeheartedly the idea of an ombudsman for the private rented sector. I think what I was saying was that the devil, will really be in the detail. We've seen, obviously, in the social sector, the improvements that the Ombudsman Service has made to kind of its resolution times and things like that. There are still obviously challenges, sometimes to do with the resourcing, the funding for the Ombudsman Service, and there will always be challenges, I think, for tenants in getting the best resolution where there is a power imbalance between landlord and tenant in many situations. I think also a lot of what Richard was saying does chime. It's really difficult surprisingly difficult sometimes for renters to understand who their landlord is, who the responsible person is, whether they are a private landlord, a social landlord, and those sorts of things. So it is really, really important that the system is clear, easy to understand, easy to use, and accessible. And again, I know the Ombudsman Service has done a lot of work on accessibility, but those are the really important things for renters. At the instant that they feel they need the support from either an ombudsman, an advice service, or a legal service, that part of the system needs to be really clear and easy to use for renters. There's a world in which there's 100 different setups behind that, but your kind of access through the front door is not clear.
One of the things that a lot of people are concerned about at the moment is if you're a renter and you complain, there's the risk of retaliatory eviction. Clearly, that's one of the issues that are addressed in the bill. Is that strong enough in the bill to prevent that happening if someone complains to the Ombudsman?
So I think, again, it goes back to what I was saying about the eviction grounds and their strengths. I think the two clearest areas of where there are potential weaknesses that we need to be absolutely sure, that those grounds are tight are the landlord need grounds, or the new no fault grounds, if you will. So a landlord wants to sell, a landlord wants to move in or move their family member in. I think there needs to be really robust evidence bar in those grounds, and we'll be campaigning as the bill goes through for clarity in the bill on that. We understand that there might be guidance, but we really do want the government to set out in legislation what it thinks the types of activities or things that landlords should have done to be able to prove their intention to sell the home or to move back in. I think also the landlord moving in ground or moving a family member in, it's difficult to imagine what really robust ground evidence looks like in primary legislation. So we need to see proper disincentives to the misuse of those grounds. One really key area there is the no reletting period. So the bill currently contains a clause that landlords can't relet the property after 3 months of using one of the landlord need grounds. And we think there's weaknesses there. First of all, we think that it should be 12 months long, not 3 months long, to act as a proper disincentive to abuse of those grounds. We think it should apply to all evictions. Currently, it only applies where tenants voluntarily vacate their property, not where the court has ordered possession. We believe the no reletting period should apply to all instances where a landlord need eviction possession notice has led to someone vacating the property. And then we think there should be something in there for tenants. At the moment, there's no route to any compensation for tenants where the landlord has misused one of the landlord need grounds or broken the no reletting period. And that's really important. We don't see that in the setup of the bill there's very strong incentives or reason for local authorities to put a lot of time and energy into the enforcement of the no reletting period. And actually we might be quite reliant on tenants to do that, particularly in circumstances where they are, and I know it doesn't sound ideal, but particularly in circumstances where they've left voluntarily after receiving a possession notice. They and the landlord are almost the only people that know that an eviction has taken place. So enforcing the no reletting period seems to be quite reliant on them. So we think there should be something in the bill like rent repayment orders where landlords have abused or broken the no reletting period to give some incentive.
I think we're broadening out from the work of the Ombudsman to other questions. So yeah. I'll draw a halt there because I think colleagues want to ask about two other questions.
Right. Look at issues to do with landlords. Ben.
Thank you, Clive. So I'll start with you, Ben.
Sorry, I think Ian wants to come and supplementary.
Just a real quick one. Sorry, Ben. Thanks. Just to Richard. In light of what Ben just said about the low take-up from the private renter sector for the voluntary ombudsman, shouldn't we looking at made it mandatory? You talked about the two-tier system. Well, that feels like a two-tier system to me.
You're right. That's what we have now, and that needs correcting. But it needs correcting in a way which avoids all the unintended consequences of people then not knowing or not being able to access. I think if you end up with different redress schemes, which is why across redress in so many different sectors, that's not what happens, and that's what the government's own guidance says should not happen. If you end up with that, you both impair access at one end, but also impact at the other, because the more fragmented the jurisdictions of an ombudsman are, then the more hamstrung they are in the decisions that they make. And I think one of the things which I'm really struck by is obviously the population that we have in private rent includes lots of vulnerable people, lots of people who will be experiencing issues with their property condition. I absolutely accept Ben's point that there are many decent landlords, but there's also 23% of homes which are non-decent in this sector. And at the moment, they don't have an effective route outside the courts to redress that if the landlord is not responsive to them. And I think, so 16% of our members under our mandatory membership have fewer than 10 homes. 18% of private landlords have more than 5 homes. There are HMOs that have to be licensed. So I think already you can see pockets of the private rented sector where right now, working with with NRLA and with others, we could start to onboard landlords, bring them into our jurisdiction, provide independent and impartial and cost-effective and timely redress, rather than wait for this big bang moment from the bill. Where there's a real risk that suddenly there'll be a lot of volatility because people will suddenly be racing to go to which service, have I gone to the right place, and so on. I think there's crucial time now that could be spent on planning and getting the pieces in place. And I would love to work with Ben's organisation. I would love to work with landlords who are HMOs, who are meant to be licensed. I'd love to work with those larger private landlords, because I think there's real benefits to them as well as to their residents.
Okay, thanks. Ben, over to you now.
Thank you, Clive. So, Ben, what are the main concerns landlords have around the ending of fixed-term tenancies in the private rented sector?
Yeah, well, I think there's two principal concerns, Ben. Firstly is the fact that somebody would be able to move in, give 2 months' notice, and then leave pretty much straight away. What we don't want to do is to turn the PRS into sort of Airbnb light. So we do need to caution against that. I get the average tenancy length is over 4 years, and I know we're in the middle of a housing supply crisis, but even so, because the knock-on effect for small landlords is significant. Those tenancy set-up costs will hurt small landlords if you get a lot of churn. The other area that it affects or will affect adversely is the student sector, and this is something I think that the committee has made in its last report references to, that if you have in open-ended indefinite tenancies for the student market, you not only knock tenants' abilities to be able to find properties when they need them, but you also knock landlords' ability to be able to provide properties when those tenants need them. And I can't honestly see what sort of problem it's trying to resolve, particularly given the admissions by government that the purpose-built student accommodation sector is kind of out on its own, retaining the fixed term and able to get possession when they need it. This isn't about Section 21 via the back door. This is about not breaking something that isn't broken yet, frankly. And so what we would like to see on these two counts, because we don't want to, we want people to stay in their homes for a long period of time, and for the student sector, we want to make sure that that sector works for both the landlord and the tenant. So we would like to mirror the sort of moratorium period that has been suggested for landlords. So if you want to move back in or you wish to sell your house, you can't give notice within the first 6 months of the tenancy. And we say that in order to safeguard against those concerns, the same should be afforded to landlords so that tenants can't give notice within the first 6 months. And what that would do is go some way to helping with the student conundrum, but also the wider concerns that, we do want people to bring their properties to the private rented sector, and we don't want to create another Airbnb. And given the concession that has been made there, we think that aligning those timeframes would work very well, with the exception if a tenant moved into the property and it was substandard, horrible condition, didn't meet safety standards, etc. Obviously, we wouldn't, there'd be no notice effectively. This is not about lowering standards. It's about striking the balance, if I coin a phrase, to make things work for both tenants and responsible landlords.
Thank you. That's quite comprehensive, and I'll come back to you in a second about the using the courts and so on, not specifically about Section 21, but we'll probably get there. But actually, I'm quite interested, Taryn, in what you think about those points that Ben raised, both in a sort of a holistic point of view, but from a shelters point of view, homelessness charity, and then specifically around the student accommodation point.
Yeah, sure. So I think we want to express concerns about what those measures would look like and how they would be designed, I think. So one of the big, really significant benefits of the ending of fixed term tenancies is the ability for renters, when they do move into a property that isn't as expected, isn't up to standard, or their circumstances change, they are able to give notice and move out those homes. Our concern would be in designing that moratorium period that Ben was talking about. Can the legislation account for those various different circumstances in which it would be legitimate, we think, for a tenant to be able to serve notice and leave? So that would be a big concern of ours with a tenant moratorium period, is that it would recreate some of the challenges that renters face in in their fixed terms. When it comes to students, I think, again, similarly, we'd be concerned about how you would design that legislation to capture the people that maybe Ben is talking about, but not exclude the various different people who, you know, technically are students but have very different living circumstances to who you might imagine would need that kind of yearly cycle. Students are a really, really diverse group of people. Many students have children, many students live with their families still, many students live with people who have caring needs and they have caring responsibilities towards them. Those people need the benefits of these reforms. They need the benefits of the end of fixed term tenancies and the end of Section 21 just as much as any other renters. So we'd be really concerned that any legislation or, you know, new eviction ground or whatever it is to kind of keep tenants in that yearly cycle and enable landlords to keep in that yearly cycle if they're predominantly letting out to students, that wouldn't impact those other renters who are students but live in different living circumstances adversely.
This is for students not living in purpose-built student accommodation.
Students not living in purpose-built accommodation. So, I believe what Ben is talking about, kind of, you know, the wider market. But, you know, there are landlords that predominantly let to students, and we just want to warn that, you know, any eviction ground, the design of it, it's really hard for us to see how it could be designed in a way that doesn't adversely impact those renters that are students but have that different living circumstances to what maybe we imagine when we hear students.
I'll show you the detail after.
Of course, there's the wider issue, of course, of supply of student housing, where, you know, if good landlords are feeling pushed out of the market, there's obviously less supply there as well. Thanks, Taryn. Ben, I'll come back to you just very briefly, because you raised the issue of Section 21 and courts and so on. How easy is it currently for landlords to use the courts when they're seeking to evict tenants who have, you know, they've got themselves in rent arrears or they're practising antisocial behaviour?
Well, it's very painful. I mean, one of the advantages, dare I say, of Section 21 is that you are able to deal with antisocial behaviour and rent arrears in a far more pragmatic way, without kind of pointing the finger, in a way that means people can go on to be rehoused. And I guess what we are looking for, we see lots of grounds that have been set out that seek to not replicate the workings of Section 21, but obviously carve out some of the issues. I don't buy the argument that Section 21 is the biggest cause of homelessness, because in 2 years' time, I'll tell you what, it'd be Section 8. We have to have a bit more of a sensible debate about some of this stuff. Around a third of repossessions are for antisocial behaviour, and we need to dial back as to what the reason is, because although landlords don't need to provide a reason, there invariably is one. It could be that they're selling, it could be that there's bad behaviour, it could be that there is rent arrears, and what we don't want to do is to legitimise rent dodgers and bad behaviour. We want to make sure that landlords are able to have the tools at their disposal to be able to deal with this effectively. And this is really important, because whilst we see the grounds and the timeframes and a mix of mandatory and discretionary grounds, the $64 million question is the system that's underpinning it. And of course, we have no clarity around what court reform looks like. I was at a meeting with some very senior judiciary last week, and the bad news is neither do they. We all want to see end-to-end digitalisation. We all want to see tenants get advice much earlier in the process. This is a two-way street. But at the moment, I don't feel any great sense of confidence that those that are suffering at the hands of antisocial behaviour are going to get their justice in a timely way. I really, really don't. And that's borne out by the fact that the MOJ can't even procure stab-proof vests very quickly. Now, if you can't procure stab-proof vests, I don't really hold a lot of hope in getting a whole new WYSI IT system up and running in the next few months. Call me a cynic. I'm normally a glass half full kind of guy, but I don't see it. And obviously the committee themselves have recommended a housing court, and all I'm saying is, actually, I love the idea of a housing court, but I'd rather we adopt some of the things that work on Section 21 so the most serious cases can be fast-tracked. I don't think that's an unreasonable request.
Priorities and resources.
Indeed, absolutely.
Yeah. Taryn, this one sounds right up your street as well.
I think we've always said we'd agree that the courts do need reform. It needs to work better for both landlords and tenants. On the tenant side, obviously, as Ben said, access to early legal advice. Legal aid has been absolutely decimated in recent decades, and we believe that with early legal advice, a lot of the cases that we see, our lawyers see in court, wouldn't end up in court as well. And that's really important to say that, there are measures that can take the pressure off the courts in that sense, and they don't necessarily need to be legislative ones that are done via the Renters Reform Bill. I would also say that, the scrutiny of the Renters Reform Bill and its implementation will be a lot longer than a few months. I know, obviously, people here want to see the courts reformed and see that they're working, but I think it's really important to say that, it's been nearly 2 months already since the first reading. We're not second reading yet. There's an implementation timeline of 6 months and then another year on the tenancy reform. So it is going to take a while to see these reforms come in, and there's a lot that the government can do to improve the court processes in parallel, and we would definitely support that. What we don't support is the weakening of eviction grounds, the shortening of notice periods as a response to issues with the courts that can be resolved in other ways, because there are concerns we have concerns that there are unintended consequences of those. I think it's really important to say as well that Section 21 evictions, we do recognise that many landlords are using Section 21 evictions for legitimate reasons, and as Ben said, there will always be a reason, but we ran some research this year, and it found that private renters who'd complained to their landlord, letting agent or local authority were 2.5 times more likely to have received an eviction notice than those who hadn't complained in that research. So it just shows that there does exist uses of Section 21 evictions that absolutely aren't legitimate, and it doesn't take many of those instances for renters to be fearful of complaining and making reasonable requests of their landlords. Furthermore, sorry, I know this is a long answer, but furthermore, landlords may be using Section 21 evictions where there are arrears or where they deem there to be antisocial behaviour. But what we don't know within that is whether, in those instances, the arrears levels are at the levels that the eviction ground, Section 8 grounds, would set out. So a landlord may be using Section 21 notice to evict for arrears, but they could be small amounts of arrears. We don't know that, and that's part of the problem with Section 21, is we can't disentangle legitimate evictions from illegitimate evictions. So that's one of the big benefits of moving to Section 8, is having those grounds really clearly set out. Tenants should understand them, landlords should understand them, and they should be fair, and eviction should be proportionate in those instances, and I think that's really important.
I think that's probably why the bill in its current form is so complex, but the complexity is going to make it very hard to adhere to. Ben, what support should the government be giving to landlords to make them be able to comply with their responsibilities under the new bill?
Yeah, I just want to quickly come back on that point, if I may, and then I'll answer that one. But I wanted to say, because this is quite important, the government has published its impact assessment on the bill, but it doesn't include an impact assessment on the measures it will have on court workload, which I think is telling, frankly. Because I think they've not considered this. And the second thing is that in all of the meetings I've had with Michael Gove and others, I'm told that timing-wise, some of this stuff is not going to come forward until Section 21 Section 21 won't be abolished until the court systems are ready. So there's a massive question mark over the timing of some of this stuff. And it's worth me pointing out, I think, for the record, that last English Housing Survey said that only in 6% of cases did a landlord ask their tenant to move on. And so we just have to be very careful that we don't, use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. I think in terms of what the government can do to help landlords, I think there's a massive opportunity with the portal. Frankly, this is, as I say, I look through things with a slightly more positive light. As a responsible landlord, and 80% meet the decent home standard, or 79% properties meet the decent home standard, give landlords an opportunity to prove that they are a good landlord. we're not all Rackmans. This is actually a tiny, tiny percentage of what's out there. And I think Michael Gove acknowledged it as recently as last week in the NRLA's own publication, multi-award-winning Property magazine, to say that he needs small landlords. And that's right. 94% of properties are owned by an individual, and just under half have one or two. We kick private landlords at their peril, and what we must do is give those responsible and decent people an opportunity to prove that their properties are in good condition, and at the same time give renters the information that they need, that they can make an informed decision. By all means, go after the bad ones, but do that in a very, very targeted way. And I think that's where the property portal will not only help landlords, not only help renters, but also help local authorities highlight who those bad landlords are. And that's why I think the quid pro quo for some of this stuff is the abolition of local selective and discretionary licensing, because two reasons. One, if the property portal isn't to that level, you've got a problem. And secondly, if you do leave a dual system, you not only have duplication, but it comes back to what we've always suggested licensing is about, and that's funding local authorities to the detriment of standards. We are about high standards. Let landlords prove it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I have a couple of points before just come on to question me in. Challenge on that, Ben. Selective licence is also about inspections, isn't it? It allows local authorities more powers to go in and inspect.
Well, I haven't had an inspection at one of my properties for years.
Right, can be arranged.
Indeed. Well, anytime. I practice what I preach, Clive.
Right. That is a difference.
Yes, there is a difference there, I guess. But this is about, if we look at selective licensing, then what we have is local authorities saying, right, well, we're going to have it for right the way across Liverpool, for example. And really, the only grounds for some element of selective licensing should be limited to a particularly problematic street. You don't need borough-wide licensing.
Perhaps they've got wider problems in Liverpool, but I'm sure he'll come on to that in a minute. Just, Darren, about student housing. I understand the concerns that somehow students are going to be discriminated against if you don't have open-ended tenancies for them. But isn't the other problem that come September, students actually want to have a place in which they can go for their academic year? And last September, there were some real horror stories around, I think, a number of universities. I mean, Manchester was one, where students were being advised to go to Liverpool. Now, I'm sure Liverpool's a very nice place to go to, but it's rather a long way to go to lectures if you live in Liverpool and have to go to Manchester. Isn't that a problem that really has to be addressed in some form? It isn't like any other form of housing, but just making the caveat that students, I think, have got concerned that being exempt from having open-ended tenancies also exempts from every other form, every other one of the reforms in the legislation. It doesn't. If you have a fixed-term tenancy, you're still going to have the same rights to the same standards and the same redress as every other tenant. Isn't that something we've got to find a way forward, haven't we?
Yeah, I think I understand the point. I think what I wanted to do was point out some of the potential pitfalls in any approach to retain that sort of fixed-term system. I understand that it's retaining aspects of it. It's not the whole thing. But yeah, I think it's just really, really important to say and really explain that students aren't this homogenous group who rent year on year and move out each year, and there's a real risk in retaining fixed term tenancies or creating a new eviction ground that students sometimes from marginalised communities, sometimes low income because they're still studying, will be put at risk by any move to kind of retain fixed term tenancies for them. I think on the supply angle as well, there's a risk and a concern, and obviously we don't know what the impacts of it would be, but creating or retaining fixed term tenancies or a new eviction ground for the purposes of students could create perverse incentives in markets where it's more attractive and more desirable to rent in the student market sector, whatever we want to call it, and that takes homes out of the family part of the market, and that could create imbalances in different ways and create new problems, which we then need to address in different ways.
Want to come back to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth pointing out that the student HMO market is an incredibly regulated market. in terms of licensing and in terms of standards. And you're right to point out the supply challenges within this sector already. But if you add to that the fact that you can't just switch tenure, landlords are not going to be able to say, oh, well, I've not been able to find a tenant, I'm going to go and find a family. That then wipes out the status of the property, and that's why it's really, really important that the student market is singled out for protecting that element. This isn't about getting rid of all of the other things around the periphery. That's fine. It's about, as I said at the outset, it's about not causing the next problem and ring fencing that fixed term in some way that keeps the cyclical element is so important.
Okay, let's move on to...
Can I just ask,
yes.
The evidence from Scotland on students suggests, because they've done this already, suggests that there's less accommodation for students and the prices of rents are going up for students. Have you got evidence of that from the National Landlords Association?
Well, I think from what we see at the moment, rents are generally increasing.
They're generally going up anyway.
Across the board.
But I'm specifically looking at student accommodation because that's a clear concern in the bill.
Yeah, I mean, in general terms, Bob, obviously the less you're going to have of something, the more it's going to cost, fact. But I'll write to you afterwards, if that's okay, with some details on student statistics, if we have them.
Okay, very well.
Ian.
Thanks, yeah. I can't leave without Ben saying that landlord licensing was hugely successful in Liverpool, Ben. Had a real impact in Liverpool on driving up standards, so I couldn't disagree with you more what you've just said there, and we can have that discussion offline, I'm sure. Taron, I want to touch on a couple of things regarding Section 21. So why have groups such as Citizens Advice described that the provisions of the Renters Reform Bill as a potential backdoor to no-fault evictions?
So I think this is what I was talking about earlier with the loopholes that potentially exist in the bill.
You just go into them for us, yeah?
Go into them in detail, yeah, sure. So I spoke earlier a bit about the landlord need grounds, so potential weaknesses in the design of those. I think I started to go into it earlier. The no reletting period is a big concern of ours. At the moment, it's only 3 months that a landlord won't be able to put the home back up on the market after using a landlord need ground. We don't think that that's a strong enough disincentive to misusing those grounds, particularly when you consider that it might be quite difficult to design robust evidential requirements for the landlord moving in ground. It's really difficult to imagine what that would look like, but obviously we want the government to try their best, but it's hard to imagine how the court could be absolutely sure that a landlord is moving in or moving their family member in and not evicting for alternate reasons. So we think there needs to be those strong disincentives via the no reletting period. So a 12-month no reletting period is what we're recommending. Rent repayment orders as a route for tenants to be able to seek compensation and seek redress where they believe that they were wrongfully evicted and they've seen either the property back up on the market or they believe that the ground was used wrongly. Some incentive for tenants to bring the cases to local authority, because at the moment the way that it's designed, in many instances it's only going to be the tenant and the landlord that know that an eviction has taken place under the landlord need grounds, and so we think there should be some incentive in there for tenants to be able to bring those cases. At the moment it's just civil penalty notices up to 30k for local authorities, but in speaking to some local authorities it's not clear that they're going to be pursuing that regularly and looking to kind of build funds via CPNs, though we think it's a good measure in the bill and should be kept in there. So yeah, improvements to the no reletting period. We think information on the property portal could help with that as well. We haven't thought about exactly the detail of this, but evictions information or tenancy information on the property portal could help local authorities better understand whether evictions had taken place and whether the reletting period had been broken. So that's another measure that might improve.
How likely is it that the new possession grounds that you're talking about would result in an increase in evictions of, say, vulnerable groups in the private rented sector? And has it solved the imbalance of power what we were talking about before? Because there is an imbalance of power, isn't it, between tenant and landlord? We know that with Section 21. Does this help to resolve that, or are we just back to where we were with Section 21? We celebrate to get rid of that, but are we back in the same position with Section 8?
I think we'd be a bit more positive than that. I think, the scrapping of Section 21 as the cornerstone of this bill is really, really important. And we have, in the first publication of the bill, a good foundation, but there definitely needs to be some tightening up of the evictions grounds. And we think that that's very, possible, including, some of those disincentives to misusing those grounds. So no, I wouldn't say that it's entirely recreating the old system, but there is a real risk there that where there is one or two weaknesses in the Section 8 grounds that
they'll be found out and they'll be utilised by bad landlords.
And be utilised by those landlords that do seek to abuse the grounds. And it doesn't take many instances of that for renters to feel fearful of making complaints, challenging rent increases. So that's the other impact. It's not just people receiving evictions, but it is concerns about or fear of eviction, preventing people from asserting their rights. So yeah, those are kind of the two main areas where we think
could there like a mandatory sign up for the ombudsman assistant to help that? Is that something which we could utilise, which potentially won't get utilised? Thinking about people who are fearful of challenging.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a role for the ombudsman in this. There's clearly a role for the ombudsman in supporting tenants to make complaints and things like that. But I think there is every chance that the ombudsman's work is undermined by structural deficiencies in the bill. So if there are those, legal routes to evicting tenants legitimately, but for alternate reasons, that could undermine the ombudsman's ability to get redress for tenants and ensure that tenants are able to assert their rights, because there is still that threat of an unfair eviction hanging over the rent.
Just going to touch on what support would a tenant need to help them about rent rises, make informed decisions around whether a rent increase is above market value, because at the moment my inbox is just full of people who've been turfed out because they can't afford to pay the rent. And then rises have happened. So what would you envisage from Chelsea's perspective?
Yeah, so I think one measure that could help with understanding the rental market and understanding whether your rent increase is unfair is, I think, there's an opportunity in the portal there. We understand at the moment the portal is designed to include safety, property information, but there could also be rent data on the property portal as a publicly available data source. That could be something that's useful to tenants in understanding whether their rent is a reasonable increase. I think one thing that we're really disappointed not to see in the bill is the promise that was in the white paper to prevent tribunals, so if a tenant wants to challenge a rent increase at tribunal, from determining a higher rent than the landlord has proposed in the first place. As an advice organisation, we are not going to be able to advise tenants that they can go to tribunal and there is no risk of their rent increasing even further with that. So it's really important that tenants feel confident and able to go to tribunal.
Just looking at the situation where we are now, just to finish, in London, I think it's 60% potentially of incomes getting utilised on rent. I think it's 40% across the country. It's catastrophic on so many levels. What's your thoughts on a rent cap elements coming in? Mayor of London's touched on it. There's other places that are looking at it. Is that something which potentially could be utilised to try and cool down the market and keep people in homes?
I think, first of all, the kind of key solutions in addressing affordability in the sector for us are supply of social housing, which would, not only provide more affordable accommodation, but also take pressure off the private rented sector.
Yeah, but that's in a perfect world. That's where we are now.
And so where we are now, something the government can immediately do is uprate local housing allowance. It's frozen at the moment and falling woefully behind private rents, particularly in London. And at the moment, because designing a rent cap policy, working through the Renters Reform Bill, scrutinising it, that will take much longer than uprating welfare and local housing allowance. Moving to the future, we think bringing in those measures that the government promised on the tribunal to support renters to feel comfortable in challenging unfair rent increases and making sure that the data is there, it's good enough for renters to challenge those unfair rent increases, and they have the security to do so.
Richard or Ben, do you want to come in on anything that's been...
Yeah, if I can, please, in order. So in terms of those two grounds, the no-fault ground, this isn't roulette. You know, it gets tested in court. It goes before a judge. A judge will need to be satisfied that the landlord is telling the truth about selling the property. And last time I checked, if you lied in court, it was perjury. So I'd say that was a pretty strong disincentive. I mean, I don't know what my friend from Shelter really wants to see, whether it's waterboarding or public flogging, but a financial penalty of 30k if you relet sounds to me to be a lot of money. And I think we have to look through the lens of why landlords are selling, and the confidence levels in the sector are where we should start, rather than having punishing 12 months waits and lots of extended notice periods that actually do your clients a great disservice. As far as the court process is concerned, it's worth pointing out, I think, that 15% of respondents' tenants reply. But it is right to make sure that those people have the help that they need if it comes to it. And in terms of things that can be done now, I would agree with Lisa Nandy and Julie James when they rule out any form of rent control or caps, and would much rather focus on something we can agree on, local housing allowance being unfrozen to help the most vulnerable, but also looking at landlords' costs as well and things that are causing them to exit the market. And that includes punishing tax changes, meaning you pay tax on your revenue, not your profit. And just in terms of the tribunal challenge, what you can't do, it is right that they've amended this in the bill, actually. You can't clip the judiciary's wings. The judiciary is totally independent. If they feel it's gone up, down, or the rent stayed the same, then that's what one has to go with. This isn't about trying to preempt what the outcome is going to be. It's an independent process, and the judiciary will decide. Now, I think the first tier tribunal does need extra resources to be able to cope with this, but the best way of bringing rents down is to look at the cost base and increase supply, and increasing social housing, but also the role that the private rented sector has in providing decent homes.
Yes, just a quick question to Ben. The evidence suggests that the number of landlords leaving the market is increasing. The number of properties, therefore, coming out of the PRS is therefore increasing. The number of properties being sold to owner-occupiers is not changing. The Section 21 notices we hear are increasing as a result of the publication of the bill. Now that suggests to me that a lot of landlords are saying, to hell with this, I'm going to go to the Airbnb market where I can charge a very large rent, there's virtually no regulation, and I don't have any problem getting rid of the tenants if I don't like them.
Yeah, well,
do you have evidence of that from your members?
Well, certainly the sentiment index that we have been running that predates the NRLA, but for a good 15 years, is showing landlord confidence at an all-time low. What I would say to you is, I mean, we know that the tax environment for furnished holiday lettings is the same as it was in the PRS until government decided to change it. And that essentially means you can offset your full finance costs like you can do anywhere else, unless you're an individual in the private rented sector. The mood music from landlords, and I was at a show last week, is that they are exiting the sector, or certainly selling off some of their properties. But what I would point to, because we've had this discussion before, is other sources, which is simply saying that supply and demand are massively out of kilter. So Zoopla's most recent data shows that demand for private rented housing is up 51% compared to the 5-year average. Rightmove notes that the number of properties is down by 46% compared with the pre-pandemic in 2019, whilst the number of people inquiring is 173% higher. Whichever way you look, there's a lead time on landlords exiting the sector, right? So what landlords say and what they do takes some time to bear out. What we know is that we have rents the highest on record, and we have all credible sources, including the Bank of England, including the government itself, saying that we have a demand and supply imbalance. And that is the thing that we should be focusing on.
Sorry, can I just ask you, sorry, this is the last thing I do want to ask for. Given your suggestion that there should be a 12 months moratorium on evicting tenants if you're going to either move your family in or sell the property before you can re-let. Given that we've got a problem of literally street homelessness is going up, homelessness is going up, would we rather have properties empty for 12 months and unused, untenanted, rather than have a position whereby landlords could actually move tenants in? It doesn't seem very logical to me.
I see what you're saying, but I think what we want to see is, proper disincentives. If you're talking about the no reletting period following the use of a landlord need eviction ground, is disincentives to the misuse of those grounds. I'll just come back to what Ben said earlier about perjury in court. We know that many tenants, or most tenants, leave once they've received an eviction notice before a court date. That's what you are likely to do if the landlord served it. Do you have figures on that? Because that would be very helpful for us to, as an organisation, maybe. I'll have a look. I'm not 100% sure, but I'll write to the committee with the data that we do have.
Well, that would be very helpful because it just helps inform us of what the position is overall.
Okay. And Richard, I think you were going to come into that follow-up.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up briefly on your question about an ombudsman. I completely recognise the point that Taryn's made around Section 21 being a barrier for people potentially raising complaints. But two brief observations. The first is that the relationship between an ombudsman and the courts process will be absolutely critical to get clarity on jurisdictions. At the moment, we deal with tenancy issues, we deal with arrears issues as well. There's a distinct role for us and there's a distinct role for the courts, and it's being absolutely clear on that so that the landlord and the consumer has an understanding of the role. I think a clear example of that would be if you move to periodic tenancies, then the role for the pre-action protocol on housing disrepair will become potentially more apparent, and we've done a tremendous amount of work with our bodies in our jurisdiction to get clarity on claims versus complaints so they don't get muddled up. And just as a final word, we have a case which we're actually going to publish very soon, probably this week, where a landlord, social landlord, issued a Section 21 notice, and it involved a resident in a wheelchair who had mobility issues in her home because of repair issues, condition issues. And again, I think it was absolutely clear that notice turned out to be invalid, but there was still a huge amount that we were able to do to provide redress for that individual for the property condition issues that they experienced, and indeed the discrimination, I would say, that they experienced. And I think, again, it's not a kind of zero sum between the courts and the ombudsman. It's about weaving those together effectively. The best way to do that is to build on the existing landlord-tenant scheme that we have in this country, rather than creating multiple versions of it.
Taryn, Shelter currently take up cases on behalf of tenants in the social housing sector who are threatened with eviction for antisocial behaviour. As an organisation which is a charitable organisation, so you represent people free of charge, do you think you have a wider responsibility to the community in which those tenants live? Because often it's other tenants who are bearing the brunt of that antisocial behaviour, yet you're often there fighting for the one who's causing it and the ones who experience it.
Well, I would just add that we do also support tenants on the other side of the relationship, experiencing antisocial behaviour or other forms of behaviour that is disturbing or upsetting to them on the other side, so those people experiencing it too. So we don't just support those who are threatened with eviction. What I would say is that, the eviction grounds as they are, those do exist. Landlords will be able to regain possession of their homes for antisocial behaviour. What we're concerned about, and this isn't to prevent all evictions for antisocial behaviour, what we're concerned about is in response to things like court delays and court complexity and things like that, that the eviction grounds are being weakened to such a level so as to enable unfair evictions of people for antisocial behaviour. So we don't know what the impact of the change to ground 14 is going to be. So it's a wording change from likely to cause nuisance or annoyance to capable of causing nuisance or annoyance. We understand there's guidance to come. What we really, really want to warn against is setting that evidence bar so low so as to bring in people who might be wrongfully accused of antisocial behaviour. We're part of the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, who have written, really helpful response to the first reading of the bill. We know that accusations of antisocial behaviour often misinterpreted domestic abuse and violence situations, often associated with mental health and neurodiverse conditions. What we want to make sure is that reforms to the eviction grounds don't unduly impact those already marginalised renters who, when faced with an eviction, will struggle more than others to find a home in the rented sector because they're more likely to be claiming benefits and more likely to be face discrimination in the sector. Just one thing before is the reduction of notice periods to 0 weeks is a big concern for us on the antisocial behaviour grounds. We understand, again, it's in response to court delays and things like that, but 0 weeks, and this may be in an ideal world, but that's how we should be designing the eviction grounds themselves. 0 weeks is not enough time for those tenants, with those already existing marginalisations, to be able to receive early legal advice and to be able to defend unfair evictions on antisocial behaviour. That's really, really important because those defences, often along the lines of the Equality Act, are complicated. They would be difficult for an individual to undertake themselves, obviously. So 0 weeks is a big concern for us in tenants accessing legal support.
Right. Very briefly, Ben.
Very briefly.
Very briefly.
The court system must be on the side of the victims, not the perpetrators. Short notice period, quick processes. We can't focus on the 1% of the 1% of the 1%.
I think the domestic abuse one's one we've asked the Minister to look at anyway, but at some point we can't carry this conversation much longer, but I'd like to talk to you about, I just don't see Shelter acting on behalf of the victims.